Students who got expelled for wearing religious symbols to school. What happened? My name is Amir Khalid, and I spent 3 years at Westfield High watching my classmates disappear one by one for wearing crosses, hijabs, yarmulkes, and turbans. The policy didn't start as an outright ban on religious expression. It crept in slowly through dress code amendments that Principal Hartley introduced during my sophomore year under the umbrella of maintaining secular learning environments and preventing religious conflict between student groups. The first version just prohibited head coverings in class, which they claimed was about identification for security purposes after a minor vandalism incident. My friend Nadia wore hijab and had to remove it during all 7 periods, sitting exposed in classrooms while teachers pretended not to notice her discomfort. She'd put it back on between classes, but the constant removal and adjustment throughout the day felt like a deliberate humiliation. The administration framed it as treating everyone equally, but somehow baseball caps and beanies worn by non-Muslim students didn't get the same scrutiny. By the end of that semester, 3 Muslim girls had transferred to other schools rather than continue the daily ritual of unveiling themselves for the institution's comfort. The policy expanded that spring to include all visible religious jewelry after someone complained about a student wearing a large wooden cross outside his shirt. Principal Hartley sent out a memo explaining that symbols exceeding 1 inch in any direction created distractions in classroom settings and needed to be tucked inside clothing or removed entirely. My Christian classmates started hiding their crosses under shirts, while Jewish students took off their Star of David necklaces at the door. The Sikh sophomore who wore a small kirpan ceremonial blade under his shirt got called to the office and told he was violating weapons policy, even though the kirpan was religious requirement and properly secured. He tried explaining the spiritual significance and that it had never been removed from its sheath, but Hartley insisted school safety superseded religious accommodation. The whole thing felt like a test to see how much they could restrict before anyone pushed back. Most families complied because they didn't want their kids targeted, or because they believed the school must have legal grounds for these rules. My parents emigrated from Egypt and were so grateful for American educational opportunities that they encouraged me to follow whatever rules the school set, even ones that felt wrong. My mother kept saying we were guests in this country and needed to respect their institutions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being asked to erase parts of ourselves to make others comfortable. That's when I started paying closer attention to which students were being pulled aside for dress code violations and which ones were ignored despite similar infractions. The pattern became obvious once you knew to look for it. By junior year, the policy had evolved into a complete ban on visible religious symbols anywhere on school property, including parking lots and sports fields. They called it the Unified Secular Campus Initiative and presented it as promoting inclusivity by ensuring no student felt marginalized by exposure to others' religious practices. The irony of marginalizing religious students to prevent marginalization seemed lost on the administration. The new rules prohibited crosses, hijabs, yarmulkes, turbans, bindis, Islamic prayer beads, rosaries, and any other items deemed religious in nature. Students arriving at school wearing prohibited items were sent to the office to remove them or call parents for alternative clothing. Repeat violations resulted in suspension, and the policy explicitly stated that religious freedom didn't extend to public school campuses because education was a secular institution. I watched my friend Isaac get written up in September for wearing his yarmulke to first period. He'd worn it every day since freshman year without incident, but now suddenly it was creating a hostile environment for non-religious students who might feel pressured to adopt religious practices. The logic was absurd, but Isaac complied after the first warning because he couldn't risk suspension affecting his college applications. He started carrying his yarmulke in his backpack and putting it on immediately after leaving campus, this small act of resistance against a policy that made him choose between his identity and his education. The ban affected different religious groups in different ways, creating this hierarchy of whose faith could be more easily hidden. Christian students could tuck crosses inside their shirts and maintain their religious identity invisibly, while Muslim girls who wore hijab and Sikh boys who wore turbans had no equivalent option. Their religious practice was inherently visible and couldn't be concealed to satisfy the school's secular requirements. This meant the policy, despite claiming neutrality, had a disparate impact on certain religious communities while barely affecting others. I started documenting who was getting written up and for what, keeping a notebook with dates and descriptions and outcomes. The administration claimed they were enforcing rules uniformly, but my notes showed that Christian students received warnings while Muslim and Sikh students received immediate suspensions for first-time violations. The selective enforcement made the discriminatory intent obvious, but proving it required more evidence than one student's notebook observations. In October, everything escalated when a senior named Simron showed up wearing her turban as she had every day for 4 years. She was Sikh and wore the turban as part of her religious practice and identity. Principal Hartley intercepted her in the front hallway before first period and demanded she remove it immediately or leave campus. Simron explained that the turban wasn't just a head covering, but a sacred article of faith that she couldn't simply take off and put back on like a hat. Hartley responded that her religious beliefs didn't override school policy, and she had 3 options: remove the turban, call her parents to bring alternative head covering, or accept a suspension for willful defiance. Simron stood in that hallway with dozens of students watching while Hartley waited for her decision. She chose suspension rather than violate her religious principles, and security escorted her off campus while she called her father to explain what happened. The image of Simron being walked out of school for wearing her turban while students in sports jerseys and club t-shirts walked freely past her crystallized how arbitrary and targeted the policy really was. Her suspension was initially set for 3 days, but when she returned still wearing her turban, Hartley extended it to 5 days for continued defiance. Simron's father tried meeting with administrators to explain Sikh religious requirements and request accommodation, but they insisted that making exceptions would undermine the entire policy and create precedent for other students to claim religious exemptions. The meeting ended with Hartley suggesting Simron might be happier at a private religious school that could better accommodate her needs, the clear subtext being that she should leave rather than challenge their authority. That week, 4 other students received suspensions for religious symbol violations. A Muslim girl named Aliyah for wearing hijab, a Jewish boy named David for refusing to remove his yarmulke during PE class, a Hindu girl named Priya for wearing a bindi on her forehead, and a Christian boy named Michael for wearing a large wooden cross outside his shirt in deliberate protest of the policy. The administration scheduled a special assembly to address what they called concerning trends in student defiance and disrespect for school authority. Principal Hartley stood at the podium and delivered a speech about how schools required certain standards of conduct and appearance to function properly, and students who couldn't abide by those standards were choosing not to participate in the educational community. He emphasized that religious freedom was important, but had limits in public institutions, and part of growing up was learning to follow rules, even when you disagreed with them personally. The entire speech framed compliance as maturity and resistance as childish stubbornness, erasing any possibility that the policy itself might be unjust. Sitting in that auditorium listening to Hartley lecture us about institutional authority while my suspended friends missed class for practicing their faith made something shift inside me. My parents had always taught me to keep my head down and not make trouble, but watching my classmates being systematically excluded for their religious identity felt like complicity if I stayed silent. That evening I started researching religious freedom law and students' rights, trying to understand whether schools could legally enforce blanket bans on religious expression. What I discovered was more complicated than simple yes or no answers. Schools had significant authority to regulate student appearance and behavior, but that authority wasn't unlimited when it came to religious expression. The First Amendment protected free exercise of religion, and courts had established that students didn't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. However, schools could impose restrictions if they had compelling educational interests, and the restrictions were narrowly tailored to serve those interests. The key questions were whether Westfield had legitimate reasons for banning all religious symbols and whether less restrictive alternatives existed that would accomplish the same goals. Reading through case law from other districts showed that blanket bans on religious symbols had been struck down multiple times for being overbroad and discriminatory, especially when they disproportionately affected certain religious groups. I printed out several relevant court decisions and brought them to our school librarian, Mrs. Chen, who'd always encouraged students to think critically about policies. She read through the materials and agreed the policy seemed legally questionable, but warned me that challenging school administration directly could have serious consequences for my academic record and future. I told her I understood the risks, but couldn't watch my friends being expelled for their faith without at least trying to fight back. Mrs. Chen suggested I contact the ACLU or similar civil rights organizations that had experience with religious freedom cases in schools, and she gave me information for a local legal aid clinic that provided free consultations. That weekend, I drafted a detailed complaint outlining the policy, its enforcement, and the students who'd been suspended, along with my documentation of selective enforcement patterns. The legal aid clinic connected me with an attorney named Rebecca Fonseca, who specialized in education law and civil rights. She reviewed my documentation and said we likely had a strong case that the policy violated students' First Amendment rights and disproportionately burdened certain religious groups. She explained that to move forward, we'd need students and families willing to be plaintiffs in a lawsuit, which meant publicly challenging the school district and accepting potential retaliation. I asked if students could face expulsion for participating in legal action against the school, and she said legally they couldn't be retaliated against for exercising their rights. But schools found subtle ways to make life difficult for students who caused trouble. The decision to proceed had to come from affected families who understood both the potential benefits and costs of fighting back. I spent the next 2 weeks reaching out to suspended students and their families, explaining that we might have legal recourse if enough people were willing to join together. Most families were afraid of making things worse, or believed fighting the system was futile against institutions with unlimited resources. Simron's family was the first to commit, saying they'd already lost everything by standing firm on religious principles and had nothing more to lose by making it official through legal channels. Aliyah's parents joined after watching their daughter cry every morning about having to choose between hijab and school. David's family signed on after his rabbi connected them with Jewish advocacy organizations that had been monitoring the policy. Within 3 weeks, we had 6 families willing to serve as plaintiffs representing Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, Hindu, and Christian students affected by the ban. Rebecca filed our lawsuit in federal court in November, alleging that Westfield High's religious symbol ban violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause and the Equal Protection Clause by imposing discriminatory burdens on students based on religious identity. The complaint included declarations from each plaintiff describing how the policy affected their religious practice and education, my documentation of selective enforcement, and expert testimony from religious studies professors explaining why certain religious symbols couldn't simply be hidden or removed without violating core faith requirements. The school district's response came swiftly through their attorneys, who argued that schools had broad authority to maintain order and secular environments, and the policy was content-neutral since it applied equally to all religious symbols, regardless of faith tradition. They claimed the suspensions were justified disciplinary actions for students who willfully defied legitimate school rules, and allowing religious exemptions would create chaos with students claiming religious grounds for violating any policy they disliked. The legal battle was framed as institutional authority versus individual rights, with both sides presenting fundamentally different visions of what public education should look like. The lawsuit made local news within days, and suddenly everyone at school had opinions about what was happening. Some students supported us and started wearing small religious symbols in solidarity, while others accused us of being troublemakers who wanted special treatment. Teachers were instructed not to discuss the lawsuit in class, which meant conversations happened in hushed whispers between periods instead of open dialogue where we might have actually learned from each other's perspectives. Principal Hartley sent an email to all families explaining that a small group of students and parents were attempting to undermine important school policies through litigation, and the district would vigorously defend its authority to maintain safe and secular learning environments. The email characterized us as outside agitators, influenced by special interest groups, rather than students genuinely affected by discriminatory policy. The distortion of our motivations into some kind of calculated political action erased the reality that we were just kids who wanted to attend school without abandoning our religious identities. My parents received that email and panicked, calling me into the kitchen for a serious conversation about whether this lawsuit was worth jeopardizing my future. My father was especially concerned that colleges would see me as a troublemaker if the lawsuit was mentioned in any school records or recommendation letters. I tried explaining that fighting discrimination was exactly the kind of leadership and civic engagement colleges valued, but he worried about practical consequences beyond idealistic principles. My mother cried and said she didn't want me to suffer for standing up when we could have just quietly transferred to another school and avoided all this conflict. Their fear was genuine and reasonable, but giving up felt like betraying everyone who couldn't afford to transfer or who shouldn't have to leave their neighborhood school because of discriminatory policies. The tension in our house grew thick as my parents struggled between pride in my principles and terror about my future, while I carried the weight of knowing my choices affected not just me, but the entire community of students watching to see if resistance was possible. The school's retaliation started subtly at first. Teachers who'd previously been friendly became distant and formal, asking me to stay after class for conversations about my attitude and engagement. My guidance counselor scheduled an unexpected meeting to discuss my post-graduation plans and suggested I might want to reconsider my college application strategy given recent circumstances. When I asked what circumstances she meant, she said colleges wanted students who could work within systems rather than constantly challenging authority, and my involvement in the lawsuit might raise concerns about my ability to adapt to institutional expectations. The message was clear, even though she never explicitly threatened my recommendations. I was being marked as difficult, and that label would follow me through the application process unless I backed down. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction with school staff, noting dates and times and what was said, building documentation in case we needed to prove retaliation as part of the lawsuit. My grades remained strong because I'd always been a serious student, but participation points in classes mysteriously dropped, and subjective assessments on group projects scored lower than objective test results. The cumulative effect was death by 1,000 cuts, making school feel hostile in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Other plaintiff students reported similar experiences, with teachers suddenly finding problems with work that had previously been acceptable and administrators monitoring their behavior more closely than their peers. Aaliyah got written up for being late to class, even though she arrived at the same time as 3 other students who received no consequences, and when she pointed out the discrepancy, she was told not to make accusations about staff being unfair. The preliminary hearing happened in January at the federal courthouse downtown, where our attorney argued for an immediate injunction preventing the school from enforcing the religious symbol ban while the case proceeded. Rebecca presented our evidence of disparate impact, showing that Muslim and Sikh students received substantially harsher punishments than Christian students for comparable violations, and that the policy served no legitimate educational purpose that couldn't be achieved through less restrictive means. The district's attorney countered that schools needed flexibility to maintain order, and that courts should defer to educational professionals' judgment about what policies served their institutions. The judge, an older woman named Catherine Brennan, asked pointed questions about why the school needed to ban all religious symbols rather than addressing specific disruptions if they occurred, and whether the administration had considered accommodations for religious practices that were mandatory rather than optional. The district's attorney struggled to articulate compelling reasons beyond generalizations about secular learning environments and potential religious conflicts, neither of which had actually materialized at Westfield before the policy was implemented. Judge Brennan said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks and encourage both parties to consider whether this dispute might be resolved through mediation rather than prolonged litigation. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt cautiously hopeful that someone in authority had actually listened to our concerns and understood the discrimination embedded in the policy. The judge's questions suggested she saw through the district's justifications and recognized the real harm being done to students, which was more than any administrator at Westfield had been willing to acknowledge. The injunction came through 10 days later, with Judge Brennan ruling that we'd demonstrated a likelihood of success on the merits, and that continuing to enforce the ban would cause irreparable harm to students' religious exercise and education. She ordered the school district to immediately suspend enforcement of the religious symbol ban pending final resolution of the case, and she noted that the district had failed to show any compelling educational interest that justified such broad restrictions on First Amendment rights. The ruling didn't declare the policy unconstitutional outright, but it effectively shut down enforcement while litigation continued and sent a clear signal about which direction the court was leaning. Simron came back to school the next Monday wearing her turban. Aliyah returned in hijab. David wore his yarmulke. Priya had her bindi, and Michael wore his cross openly outside his shirt. Walking through those hallways with my friends finally able to express their religious identities without fear felt like a massive victory, even though I knew the legal battle was far from over. Principal Hartley sent another email to families explaining that the district was complying with the court order under protest and still believed their policy was legally sound, which felt like sour grapes from an administrator who'd lost the first round. Teachers received updated guidance about not enforcing the religious symbol ban, but were told to document any disruptions or conflicts that arose from students wearing religious items, clearly hoping to build evidence that the policy served necessary purposes. The administration's strategy was transparent: create problems to justify the discriminatory policy rather than simply allowing students to practice their faith peacefully. The atmosphere at school shifted in complex ways after the injunction. Some students who'd been afraid to wear religious symbols now felt emboldened to express their faith openly, while others remained cautious about drawing attention. Teachers who'd supported the ban openly complained about the court interfering with school administration, while others seemed relieved to stop enforcing a policy that had always felt wrong. My friendship networks expanded as I connected with students across different religious communities who shared the experience of having their faith treated as a problem to be managed. We started eating lunch together and studying in the library, creating informal support systems for dealing with the ongoing tension and hostility from staff who resented our challenge to institutional authority. These relationships gave me perspective on how different religious traditions approached similar questions about identity and accommodation, and how much diversity existed even within faith communities about what level of visibility or practice was essential. Simron explained how wearing her turban was non-negotiable because it was a core article of faith, while David described how some Jewish students wore yarmulkes only during prayer, while others wore them constantly as ongoing religious expression. Understanding these distinctions made clear that any blanket policy would inevitably violate someone's sincere religious practice, and the only respectful approach was allowing individual students to express their faith as their tradition required. The conversations also revealed how much ignorance existed about different religious practices, with students having never learned about Sikh articles of faith, or Islamic hijab requirements, or Hindu bindi significance beyond surface-level stereotypes. The policy had prevented these conversations by forcing everyone to hide their religious identity rather than creating opportunities for genuine understanding across differences. The district filed an appeal of the injunction in February, arguing that Judge Brennan had overstepped by interfering with school administration and that continuing the policy was necessary to prevent religious tensions from escalating. Their brief painted an apocalyptic picture of what would happen if students were allowed to wear religious symbols, claiming it would lead to proselytizing, conflicts between religious groups, and pressure on non-religious students to adopt faith practices. The predictions felt disconnected from reality since we'd been wearing religious symbols for months without any of these problems materializing, but the district's attorneys needed to manufacture justifications for their discriminatory policy. The appellate court scheduled oral arguments for late spring, giving us several more months of limbo where the injunction remained in effect, but could theoretically be reversed. Rebecca warned us that appellate courts sometimes deferred more strongly to school authority than trial courts, and we should prepare for the possibility of the injunction being lifted and enforcement resuming. The uncertainty made it hard to fully relax, even though we were currently winning, because everything could change with one unfavorable ruling. I channeled the anxiety into organizing a student coalition that advocated not just for religious freedom, but for broader reforms to discriminatory dress code policies and disciplinary practices. We called ourselves Students for Inclusive Education and started documenting other problematic school policies that disproportionately affected marginalized groups, from hair texture restrictions that targeted Black students to English-only rules that punished multilingual students for speaking their native languages. The religious symbol ban wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of institutional bias that needed systematic challenge rather than piecemeal litigation. My college applications went out that winter with a personal essay about fighting the religious discrimination policy and what I'd learned about institutional power, civil rights law, and community organizing. Several teachers refused to write recommendation letters for me, citing my challenging relationship with school administration, but Mrs. Chen and two other sympathetic teachers wrote strong letters emphasizing my leadership and commitment to justice. The guidance counselor's letter was notably cool and focused heavily on my academic performance while barely mentioning extracurricular involvement or character, which Rebecca said might be grounds for a retaliation complaint if my college prospects were damaged. I tried not to obsess over things I couldn't control and focused instead on keeping my grades strong and continuing advocacy work that felt meaningful, regardless of how admissions officers judged it. The waiting period before hearing from colleges felt interminable, especially because I couldn't tell whether the lawsuit would help or hurt my chances. Some schools explicitly asked about disciplinary actions, and I had to explain that while I'd never been suspended, I was involved in litigation against my school district for civil rights violations, framing it in ways that highlighted principles rather than conflict. In March, I started receiving acceptance letters from several schools, including my top choice, a small liberal arts college known for social justice programs and student activism. The acceptance packet included a handwritten note from the admissions director saying my essay about fighting religious discrimination had been the most powerful statement she'd read that year, and they looked forward to having students who challenged injustice rather than accepting it passively. Reading those words made all the stress and conflict feel worth it. Validation that resistance to discrimination wasn't career suicide, but actually demonstrated the kind of character and conviction that good institutions valued. The appellate court hearing in May brought our entire legal team and several plaintiffs to watch oral arguments about whether the injunction should stand. The three-judge panel asked tough questions of both sides, pressing the district's attorney on why less restrictive alternatives wouldn't achieve their stated goals, and pressing our attorney on where schools' legitimate authority to regulate student appearance ended. Rebecca handled the questioning skillfully, emphasizing that we weren't arguing for unlimited religious expression, but for reasonable accommodations that balanced institutional needs with constitutional rights, and pointing out that the district had never tried targeted interventions before implementing a blanket ban. The judges seemed particularly interested in the disparate impact evidence, asking several questions about why Muslim and Sikh students received harsher punishments than Christian students if the policy was truly neutral and content-blind. The district's attorney struggled to explain the enforcement patterns beyond saying that different violations occurred in different contexts that required different responses, which sounded like rationalization for discriminatory treatment, even if that wasn't the conscious intent. After 90 minutes of argument, the chief judge thanked both sides and said a decision would be issued within 8 weeks, which meant we'd be waiting through graduation and into summer before knowing whether the injunction would hold. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt exhausted from months of legal stress, but also proud of how far we'd come from that initial research session in the library to oral arguments in federal appellate court. Regardless of the outcome, we'd forced the district to defend their discriminatory policy in public and created a record that other students could use to challenge similar bans in their schools. Graduation approached with the lawsuit still pending and relationships at school still strained from months of conflict. Principal Hartley made the decision to exclude me from the student speaker lineup despite my grades putting me in the top 10% of the class, claiming the selection committee had chosen speakers who best represented Westfield's values and community spirit. The exclusion felt petty and vindictive, one last punishment for challenging his authority, but I'd learned to expect retaliation from administrators who viewed any questioning of their policies as personal attacks. My parents attended graduation looking proud but worried, still uncertain whether my activism would ultimately help or harm my future prospects. When Simron's name was called and she walked across the stage wearing her turban to accept her diploma, the Muslim and Sikh families in the audience erupted in applause that lasted far longer than for other students, a moment of collective celebration that their children could graduate while maintaining their religious identity. Principal Hartley looked uncomfortable during the extended applause, but he couldn't stop families from expressing support for students who'd fought discrimination, even if he disapproved of their methods. After the ceremony, dozens of parents approached me to say thank you for standing up when they'd been too afraid to challenge the system themselves, and several younger students said they'd been inspired to speak up about other unjust policies. The gratitude felt overwhelming because I'd never sought recognition, just wanted to stop watching my friends being excluded for their faith, but apparently the lawsuit had resonated beyond our immediate circle and given others courage to resist institutional injustice in their own contexts. The appellate court decision came down in July while I was working a summer job before college. The ruling upheld the injunction and went further, declaring that Westfield's blanket ban on religious symbols violated the First Amendment and ordering the district to revise their policies to allow reasonable religious expression that didn't substantially disrupt education. The unanimous decision emphasized that schools couldn't impose content-based restrictions on student speech and religious exercise without compelling justification, and that Westfield had failed to demonstrate any educational need for banning all religious symbols rather than addressing specific problems as they arose. The court was particularly critical of the disparate impact evidence, noting that the district's enforcement patterns suggested discriminatory intent even if administrators claimed neutral application of neutral rules. The decision effectively ended the Unified Secular Campus Initiative and required the school board to develop new dress code policies in consultation with religious communities and civil rights organizations to ensure future rules didn't burden students' free exercise rights. Rebecca called me with the news and said this was a landmark victory that would influence religious freedom cases in schools across the region, and that the students who'd been suspended would likely be entitled to compensation for the constitutional violations they'd endured. I felt relief more than celebration, exhausted from 2 years of fighting and ready to move forward with college rather than continuing to battle my former school district. The victory was meaningful but incomplete, because winning legal cases didn't erase the trauma of being treated as a problem for practicing your faith, and it didn't guarantee that future administrators wouldn't find new ways to discriminate against students whose identities challenged institutional comfort. I started college that fall with a complicated relationship to activism and institutional change. The lawsuit had taught me that resistance was possible, and that determined groups of affected people could challenge unjust policies successfully. But it had also shown me how much personal cost came with speaking up and how many people would choose compliance over confrontation even when their rights were violated. My first-year roommate asked about the lawsuit after finding news articles online, and I found myself downplaying the significance because I didn't want to be defined solely by one conflict with my high school. But over time, I realized that experience had shaped my understanding of power and justice in ways that informed everything else I studied and every future action I took. The fight for religious freedom at Westfield hadn't been about one policy, but about whether institutions respected students' full humanity or demanded we fragment ourselves to fit their comfort zones. Choosing to resist fragmentation meant accepting consequences and uncertainty, but it also meant living with integrity rather than shame about fundamental parts of identity. Years later, I went back to Westfield to speak at an assembly about civil rights and student activism, invited by new administration that wanted to acknowledge past mistakes and promote more inclusive policies. Standing in that auditorium where I'd once listened to Principal Hartley lecture about institutional authority, I told current students about the lawsuit and what we'd learned about challenging injustice within systems that claimed neutrality while enforcing discrimination. Some students understood immediately, while others looked confused about why wearing religious symbols had been prohibited in the first place, which showed how quickly institutional memory faded without people actively preserving these stories. I emphasized that fighting discriminatory policies required documentation, coalition building, and willingness to accept personal risks for collective benefit, and that one person resisting became labeled a troublemaker, but multiple people organizing created movements that couldn't be dismissed. The diversity of students in that audience, many wearing hijabs and turbans and crosses and yarmulkes and bindis freely, demonstrated how much had changed since the Unified Secular Campus Initiative tried to erase religious expression from school grounds. But I also warned them that victories weren't permanent, and that future administrators might try implementing similar restrictions under different justifications. So each generation of students needed to stay vigilant about protecting rights that previous generations had fought to establish. If this story resonated with you, there are many more waiting. Hit that subscribe button and join the conversation about institutional justice and student rights. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.